Welcome to MarsCast, the official podcast of Mid-America Reformed Seminary, where faculty and friends explore the depths of faith, unpack biblical truth, and engage with the critical issues of our time. Well, today we're revisiting one of the most hotly debated topics in modern Christianity, and that is Christian nationalism. If you remember, a couple of years ago, we did a part one series on this topic. So joining me for this conversation is the one and only Dr. Alan Strange, interim president of the seminary and professor of church history. Dr. Strange, how are you doing today?
I'm doing quite well. It's good to be with you and all of our wonderful listeners. As you know, we do deeply appreciate each and every one of you and are thankful for your support for us, of us in every way. It's good to be with you.
This episode will set the stage for a deeper dive into the differing perspectives and conflicts within this movement. Dr. Strange, you're going to be referencing materials from an article that you wrote in the December 2023 issue of our newsletter, The Messenger, which was on Christian nationalism, but you're also going to highlight the ongoing tensions between two camps, what you call the so-called boomers, like Doug Wilson, James White, and Joe Boot, and the newer voices of what is known as the New Christian Right, including Stephen Wolfe and Joel Webbin. So we're going to explore how these debates reflect broader questions about faith, politics, and the mission of the church. But Dr. Strange, remind us, what do we mean when we talk about Christian nationalism, and how has the conversation evolved in recent years?
Jared, perhaps I should at the outset of the podcast make an observation or two. When I speak about Christian nationalism in this series, I'll be largely doing so descriptively. In other words, we'll be thinking about what is this recent thing called Christian nationalism, whatever there's been in the past that may be called something by that name. I'm going to be seeking to understand together something of those dynamics. I call it this, descriptively. In other words, I'm going to be talking about Christian nationalism descriptively because prescriptively, I don't think there really is such a thing as Christian nationalism. I think nationalism, depending on what one means by it, can rather innocuously be held. National borders and immigration being regulated for maximal benefit and the flourishing of citizens. Yeah, people can talk about that. And you can talk about nationalism, I think, in a perfectly proper way. I would say this isn't contrary to Christianity. What is contrary to Christianity is some sort of nationalism that teaches racial superiority. For example, the nationalism of Germany in the 1930s, and that some people seem to be wanting to reprise in our own times. Christians are always bound to think and act in a Christian manner in all that they do. I think we need to be clear in this series. There's no proper divorce ever between faith and politics. At the same time, we'll see this again, as we've talked about even before in the series, there's no detailed divine blueprint for political and civic life. So there are Christian perspectives on politics, but Christians may differ about how that actually gets carried out in the details. There is no one distinctly Christian approach to politics to the exclusion of all others. So there's a Christian approach to nationalism, but not Christian nationalism as such. Biblically, there is no one mandated Christian approach to all matters political. I just think we need to be clear about that at the outset. While some of the mainstream media have applied over the last few years the label Christian nationalism broadly, encompassing many people, all conservative Christians interested in politics in some cases, there's a narrower use, particularly by Christians who take this title for themselves. They appropriate the Christian nationalist label for their own, and that's what we're going to talk about. Let me just say this. There are two Reformed approaches to politics relevant to our subject. A two-kingdom natural law model, which has older and newer versions, and a neo-Calvinist approach, which can be either Kuyperian or some version of theonomic reconstructionist. Both are used in defense of Christian nationalism and the Allied attempt to reestablish some form of Christendom. Though the newer version of Natural Law and Two Kingdoms, say that of David Van Drunen, Michael Horton, and others, and Kuyperianism don't have any sympathy at all for Christian nationalism. We should be clear about that. And so what I'm going to be focusing on in our time together is those that take a kind of reconstructionist or general equity theonomic approach on the one hand, or who have their own sort of older two-kingdom approach on the other. Steve Wolf, for example, particularly takes such an approach. But Christian nationalism has been applied rather indiscriminately to many perceived as Christian and politically conservative. Christian nationalism has been used, in other words, by many on the political left as a term of disfavor for those that they see as their opponents on the right. And one of the real reasons for this is Christian has been used as a part of this descriptive Christian nationalism because many white evangelicals, 78%, voted for Donald Trump in 2016. And even a greater majority did so in 2020, 81%. We don't know what the percentage is that voted for Mr. Trump in the recent election. But I should just say at this point, the recent election of Mr. Trump is not going to lessen the discussion about Christian nationalism, I think. Yeah. It's only going to increase it. And so I should just say, though, that percentage that I gave you of white evangelicals is only marginally more than usual because they've been voting Republican really for decades. So to say it just has to do with Trump isn't quite accurate. Nixon, and especially since Reagan, there's been a shift among many Christian evangelicals to the Republican Party. And so that's one of the factors. The problem with those who proudly self-identify, not who are just called that, any of us may be called that by the media, but those who self-identify proudly as Christian nationalists, is that they want to combine Christian with nationalism in a way that's inimical to the adjective Christian. Their nationalism, as we talked about in the earlier series, is the old blood and soil sort of late 19th and early 20th century German, French, and English nationalism, which not only privileges the culture of the dominant people group, but calls for the maintaining of ethnic purity. Yeah. And so that kind of an association is really troubling, because how such would work without coercion here in America is not conceivable, since we have a highly variegated society and there's no way to go back of it and to return to something less mixed, more pure, so to speak, less heterogeneous, more homogeneous. We can't go back to the day in which America largely reflected, in other words, a British Protestant heritage. That simply there's no way to do that, certainly without a great deal of violence. Well, what I'd like to talk about here for a bit is in terms of an approach to Christian nationalism, is the approach that comes from the side of Doug Wilson and some of his friends. And we're going to talk more particularly about Doug Wilson later, but I want to talk about a shorter book, a book that Wilson endorsed by Andrew Torba and Andrew Isker, called Christian Nationalism, A Biblical Guide for Taking Dominion and Discipling Nations. And I think that book will serve and has served for many just folks out in the pews as a kind of book for them, more than something like Stephen Wolf's Christian Nationalism, which is a much bigger, longer book. So this is a short little book, Torba and Isker's book, taking our Christian Nationalism, A Biblical Guide for Taking Dominion. And so what they say is the work calls for dominion. That's a common theme that you get in this literature, and calls for every man to take dominion over himself, quote, over his wife and children, end quote, asserting, here's what they say, our children will be homeschooled, not attending drag shows, not watching Netflix filth, not be tuning in to Fox News or CNN or on Facebook. Now, let me say this about that. History has shown time and again that one generation's vibrant commitments are often abandoned by following generations, regardless of how hard the committed generations tried. It happened with the Puritans in Old and New England, particularly in New England in the 17th, 18th centuries. It happened in the 19th century in America as well, particularly after the U.S. Civil War. We should always be as faithful as we can in response to the great grace and love of our God, to be sure. But we cannot secure the future of generations to come. Those who assert such are not really apt pupils of history. You can't secure what future generations will do. And further, the fervor and control that goes into securing future generations, what one has to do to seek to do that, is often part of the very thing that tends to alienate them. Because what I said in the above quote is the determination of some parents now, no Fox, no Facebook, doesn't mean that their children are all going to agree with that. It doesn't mean it will be shared by the rising generations, and we see time and again that it's not. As I say, I agree. We're to be faithful. We're to seek to train our children as best we can. We leave the results to the Lord. But these types, these Christian nationalist types in this Torba and Isker book, they routinely express the assurance that their faithfulness will secure that of future generations. That's an old federal vision error. That's an old federal vision error, and I think it's still very much there. It's very much in all of this. It's always and only God's will and faithfulness that determines the response of future generations. Christian nationalist proponents call for the reclaiming of the whole nation by towns, counties, states, by exiting the beast system, they say, completely, and building our own parallel society, lying in wait for their system to collapse, which is when the godly infrastructure we've built will fill the vacuum. So this is what will prepare, they say, Christian nationalists say, to wage a multi-generational spiritual war against the demonic anti-Christian worldviews that are dominating our culture and Western society. I'm quoting Christian nationalists. I'm quoting Andrew Torba and Isker. The sons of such stalwarts, they say, will have been through the classics. This is what they say they're going to teach their children. All of Greek philosophy, the entire Bible. They'll know how to build things with their hands, shoot guns, grow food, hunt, fish, lift weights, and start a business by the time they're 18. And I ask this question. What if any of those boys prefer to become a mechanic, a doctor, a lawyer, a professor, or even a minister? What are we going to do with all these countless small businesses, many of which will fail? Wow, what a lack of understanding of all of this. Christian national advocates may fervently want their vision for the future to come about, but that doesn't mean it will. Such planning for the details of future generations has failed all throughout history, including American history. Finally, and this is particularly interesting as I kind of wrap up my look here, little look at the book by Torba and Isker. The authors acknowledge their book is the result of collaboration and influence from across the Christian faith. What do they mean by this? Interestingly, now these fellows are both Reformed. This is what they mean by they're going to collaborate across the Christian faith. That Protestant, Roman Catholic, and Eastern Orthodox brothers and sisters have inspired us to publish this book. So I would say this, whatever differences there may be between these, Roman Catholic, Protestant, and Eastern Orthodox, our authors say, we know that we must work together across the faith to combat these wicked non-Christian worldviews to defend and grow Christendom. I don't disagree that there's a proper place for what Franz Schaeffer and others called back in the day co-belligerency, for example, in which Protestants could make common cause with other traditions, including non-Christian ones, in achieving something common, opposing abortion, for example. However, Torba and Isker argue we can make common cause in defending and developing Christendom with Christian traditions that subvert the gospel of Christ alone, by grace alone, all through faith alone, some bigger project called Christendom seems more important than the Christian faith as defined and defended in the Reformed confessions and catechisms.
So could you, with that laid out on the table, give us a little teaser for what's to come in future episodes? How has the conversation evolved in recent years?
Well, this is quite a question, and there's quite a lengthy answer to it, but hopefully we can give a manageable one. What I mean by the lengthy answer is there's been a great deal of internecine or internal fighting, especially in recent months, by the different groups. And some of it has been between those who are to kingdom and those who are more theonomic and reconstructionist in their foundations, but that's not quite exactly the way the lines fall. For example, you mentioned the boomers. There's been a concern that a lot of this, as I mentioned in the earlier series that I did, this could tend towards, insofar as it had a kind of similar sound and feel to some German nationalism, could tend towards anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
Well, such anti-Semitism has come forth by Corey Mahler and Stone Choir, by people at the Pactum Institute, people like Michael Spangler has been writing on race and so forth. So both racial and anti-Semitic matters have arisen. And what you referred to earlier as the boomers, that is Douglas Wilson and James White and those fellows, have issued a declaration, an Antioch declaration, saying, we condemn this anti-Semitism. We condemn this racism. So they have condemned what they see as the extreme over on their side. It's interesting that Joel Webbin, who tends to agree with those fellows I just mentioned, he's theonomic and reconstructionist, but he's more allied with Stephen Wolfe, and they are critical of this criticism. Now, they've issued their own document called Natural Affection document that I was just looking at again. So there are these documents that have been issued, but there is a war going on within the Christian nationalist camp.
That's all for today's introduction to our second series on Christian nationalism. In the next episodes, Dr. Strange is going to narrow down even more and break down the differing perspectives of key figures like Stephen Wolfe and Doug Wilson. Thank you for your continued support of Mid-America Reformed Seminary and this podcast. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. I'm Jared Luchabor. This has been an episode of MarsCast. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.